When Mother's Day means celebrating your mom, your wife, maybe even your daughter as a new mom, trust 1-800-Flowers to help you celebrate every important woman in your life. With double blooms from 1-800-Flowers, order 1 dozen roses and get another dozen for free. It's a simple way to give beautifully, with colorful blooms that make Mother's Day feel meaningful. For every mom you're celebrating, order with confidence and get double blooms at 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast.
This is Peter.
And this is Tom.
And you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcasts. All right, this is Peter Zablocki and Thomas Reska, and welcome back to our podcast. This is the first one of the new year, Tom, 2023.
Yes, still going.
Still going strong. Who would have thought, right? It was just like, oh, let's do a podcast, 3 years later.
Yeah, we're still going there. We're still coming up with ideas, still coming up, with the content, I guess. And I guess people are still somewhat listening. So here we go.
So today's topic, Tom, what do we got today?
Well, today we're going to be looking at, through the United States, nearly 250-year history, that the presidents who proudly served in the armed forces, showing that they're not only willing to lead the country, but possibly even lay their lives on the line for it. And how it's also changed through the years, I guess you can say. Like, it was like a political asset to be in the military. And now a lot of political pundits say it's actually like a liability now. If they served in the military, actually might be hurting them, because we haven't, and we'll talk about that.
We'll talk about it.
I was surprised to see that too, but a lot of it's basically what they say out there, and the facts kind of back it up.
And that's the interesting thing when I started doing this research about fighting presidents, because the basic broad aspect was, let's see which presidents actually served in the military, and we got some conflicting numbers, but I think we settled, you and I, on 31, right?
Technically 31 served, but 29 are like the
active or something.
Active, yeah, yes.
And even out of those 29 active service, not all of them actually did
see combat.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part too, because I think you think of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and you're like, oh yeah, this guy totally. But a lot of Dwight D. Eisenhower stuff before he became the president was really behind a desk and really masterminding, D-Day and so on and so forth. But there are some presidents that were literally in the trenches. They were literally fighting. They were able to somehow influence outcomes of battles and wars. And those stories are actually interesting. And one is kind of funny, and I'm sure we'll get to it, but I don't know if when you were looking through this, I found Franklin Pierce in the Mexican-American War it's kind of funny, actually. I don't want to make it sound like it's funny because it's a war, but once we get to that story, you guys will know that his fighting was a little funny. Anyway, so let's talk about some of these guys. Again, we might talk about some more than others because some simply did more than others, but we'll try to mention the whole 31, 29 that actually were in service on some.
At some level, yeah. We don't want to just read off lists here, but it's important to talk about some more well-known stories. Some we might have touched off before, but I guess we might as well start with the first one. Also, the first one of our podcast way back in when, right? I guess starting off with our list would be George Washington, right?
Yeah.
Who served from 1789 to 1797. That's when he was president, obviously, but he was part of the military.
Yep.
He was a commander of all the troops in Virginia at a young age of 23. He was the Major General and the Continental Army's commander during the Revolutionary War. Obviously, he became president, after the war ended. He still holds the highest rank ever. We talked about that in his military service. He said he sets the precedent for so many things. He sets the precedent for this too. And what you see a lot in this is that it's the popularity that the wars bring, that the military service brings, and that kind of propels them to the presidency, at least in the early part of the of American history. That a lot of the generals and so forth and war heroes, so because their names are well known because of what they did in war, and then that kind of tapers off as time goes on.
Yeah, and like you mentioned earlier in the intro, this is definitely a stepping stone during this time. The idea that if you were in the military, you proved yourself, you proved your leadership qualities, therefore you are capable of leading a nation.
Capable of leading, yeah.
And George Washington was he was more of a military man than he was a politician in any way, shape, or form. As you mentioned, this guy, age of 23, he's already fighting for the British crown, the continental or colonial militias, before he ever becomes the Major General of the Continental American Army. And even then, he was really the only choice to lead the American forces. They were like, this guy's the only experienced one. And even after he became president, listeners remember this, but during a Whiskey Rebellion where Americans basically decided that they were not going to want to, at least certain Americans in Pennsylvania, were not going to pay a tax on whiskey, which is one of the first instituted taxes under the U.S. Constitution. George Washington brought together a militia, and himself at the head was like, all right, well, I'm the commander in chief of the armed forces as the president, and therefore I need to lead them into battle. And he only symbolically led them for a few miles before he gave the command over to Alexander Hamilton. But even as president, he's still reverting back to like military leadership and rule, which is kind of cool.
Again, it was his popularity, his leadership that was able to even raise that army and do what he needed to do and all that other things there.
All right, so let's run through some of the other ones that are like less
known.
Well,
if you want to go number 2, John Adams, he did not serve in the military. So again, you get the opposites. Thomas Jefferson did. Right, he was a colonel regiment in the Virginia militia, so he had some experience, not much. He took command of the, like we said before, the militia, and then he later built his Monticello home, actually, where he served in the military.
That's cool. I didn't know that. You have Madison, Monroe, both served. Again, as you mentioned, this stems from the fact that a lot of these people were involved by sheer coincidence, due to the fact that we have a Revolutionary War happening, and
that's what they did. I mean, that's what you did at that time. If you were a
gentleman,
he served in the military. And Madison was actually interesting because he was in poor health during that time. He was a commander in the Orange County Regiment in Virginia, but he actually never saw active military service because he was so sick during that time.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Monroe, who was Madison's like protege, he did serve. He fought
1775 to 1778. He was Continental Army. He was known for actually fighting. Like, he was wounded on the battlefield.
Yeah,
I'm actually in the Battle of Trenton, that famous Washington Christmas
crossing
Delaware. He actually got was injured there, and he was known for being very brave on the battlefield, from what everything I saw about him. But he winds up resigning from active duty in 1778 to go study law under Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, I think like if you skip a little bit, and then the next president that actually did have a military career, and very much so in the same vein as George Washington rode this military career to the White House, is kind of a controversial figure by today's standards, but that's Andrew Jackson.
Yes.
And he fought essentially in 2 wars, War of 1812 and the Indian Wars.
Yeah. Old Hickory. That's right. His
desire to fight really started in the Revolutionary War. He was only 13 years old, and he was already a messenger for a militia unit in the Revolutionary War as a little kid. He was captured at one point, and he refused to shine the boots of a British officer. So the British officer actually used this saber to like nick Jackson's face a little bit and gave him a scar. And then from that point forward, he was just like, he hated the British. He was like, you know what, I'm good. If I ever get a chance to kill the British people, I will. And obviously he was a little kid, so the war ended. He never really had a chance. But there is a part 2 of this war, which we also did a podcast on, and that's the War of 1812. And that's really when he kind of gets his revenge. So he's a general at this point, and his most famous military success is at the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812.
Well, the war was over, but that's a whole, that's a whole other podcast.
He never got the memo.
Go back there. Yeah, but it made him very popular. He became this common man hero, which again,
because he killed. I mean, they said he held off 11,000 British troops trying to take over New Orleans. His force only had like less than half of that. It was like 4,700 men, and basically he just repelled the British attacks and killed thousands of them in like minutes, really. Well, I would say about a half hour. And this was the first real victory against a British force, although, as you mentioned, the battle takes place after the war ends, but no one, literally, the memo just didn't get through to the front lines that this was over. But he became...
Wasn't any tweets back then.
Yeah, right. He became super famous for this. This made the general be the general. And then after that, he's really put in command of American forces to try to settle a lot of Native American disputes, mostly Native American disputes with white American settlers, particularly in the Georgia-Florida line. We're talking about the Seminole Native Americans, and he's sent into Florida to try to somehow squash this Native American rebellion. Meanwhile, he winds up taking over Florida, which further gains more popularity for the guy, that he's expanding American frontiers, but still, even at the time, controversial of how violent he was in suppressing Native American uprisings.
Yeah, he really, and yeah, but didn't he also like adopt? I know I think we did a podcast on
Yeah,
adopting,
he did.
didn't we?
He did wind
But he
up
also
adopting an Native American. Yep.
adopting Native Americans. He's very, like you said, controversial and went different. Like I don't know. He's just a complicated fella.
The next guy I think is also actually the same wars, War of 1812 and
Yeah,
Indian Wars. And this guy became a little less known, I would say, in American history, but still became president and basically made a name for himself during the same time as Andrew Jackson, just to a lesser extent. Like Andrew Jackson was, Andrew Jackson. And that is William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was the commander of American forces at Tippecanoe, which is kind of
that's
became
right.
a
That's right.
slogan that brings him to the White House. Right, Harrison and Tippecanoe. Um, there was how did it go? Tippecanoe and Harrison too, or something like that.
Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Tyler too. Oh, because
Ty-
because he was the
Tyler becomes his vice
vice.
president. Later becomes president also.
Yeah,
But Harrison did win gold medals for his victories in the War of 1812.
yeah. No. He was
So
like
he
he was
was yeah, he
legit
was the
guy.
command army of the Northwest. So he was like legit. And again, this is the ninth president, and you're seeing this. These early presidents are all really, with the exception of Madison, right?
Yeah,
Adams, I mean, are all pretty much these war heroes for the
yeah.
most part.
And this one is also controversial, William Henry Harrison. So his biggest nemesis was Tecumseh, and Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet. Native Americans began using these visions and magic, and they incited a lot of Native Americans in the Indiana Territory against American settlers, stating these ideas that there was certain protective magic that would protect natives against American forces. In 1810, so before the War of 1812, Tecumseh actually winds up meeting Harrison, who's at the time the governor of Indiana Territory, and he meets him with about 400 warriors and demands a treaty, a recession really of a former treaty that granted lands to whites. And Harrison refuses this, so Tecumseh orders his warriors to kill Harrison, but Harrison winds up like drawing his sword, stopping his own murder. At that point, they kind of know each other already. So Tecumseh and Harrison don't like each other going forward. Then the war comes 2 years later when Tecumseh's forces and Native American forces allied themselves with the British. And Harrison has an excuse that he's fighting the British, but really this is his way of trying to settle some old
Yeah,
scores with Tecumseh.
ulterior motives over there.
Yep, and they basically the biggest known battle happens at Tippecanoe, which becomes Harrison's nickname. They call him Tippecanoe from that point forward, and that's where you had the Native Americans and their like magic that was supposed to protect them doesn't really protect them because Harrison winds up defeating the British and getting his vengeance against Tecumseh during this battle, which basically leads to Tecumseh's death. And Americans wind up like burning the local settlement that was built by Tecumseh. But yeah, he doesn't become president for too long. Obviously, he rides this all the way to the White House, and then Harrison delivers the longest inaugural speech in American history without a coat on a cold, wet day. This results
The
in the
shortest,
shortest
yeah.
presidency.
That's more or less his footnote in. Well, I guess he has some more, but that's what most people probably know him for. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so let's hit up next guy that's kind of legit here that did some stuff.
Well, yeah. Well, we said Taylor was there. Yeah. I guess we're not going to go through every single one. I mean,
no,
Taylor
just go to some of the
Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole War. Polk was there. He
Tennessee
fought a
militia.
little bit. Yeah, a little bit. I don't think they said he didn't see any active service, right?
Nope. No, his military prowess comes from the fact that he brought the United States into war with Mexico, but that was after he's already president.
Yeah.
Taylor, though.
Zachary Taylor did a little bit. Yeah, Taylor did a little bit. Well, he aspired to be a military. He always wanted to be in the career, in the military. That was kind of what he wanted to do. And he did serve for a while. And when he was young, that's what he wanted to do. He served in the Army from 1808 to 1849, climbed the ranks during the War of 1812, fought in the Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole War. And during the Mexican-American War, he became Major General.
Yeah, old rough and ready.
And so that's kind of like that success made him a national hero and then ushered him into becoming the president right after that. Popularity of the war is what allowed him to become president.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because you see some like juggling here for power, and Polk is basically trying to suppress Taylor's popularity. Yeah. Same premise, right? Taylor cuts his teeth fighting Tecumseh during the War of 1812. He actually holds Fort Harrison with 20 men against 600, and there's this battle cry that Taylor never surrenders. When the War with Mexico breaks out, he is the general known as the Old Rough and Ready. Lost only 37 men against an army that vastly outnumbers his own. And in Monterey, right, he captured the entire city of Monterey in about 4 days, and it was considered the biggest victory up to this point. They said to compare this to like the greatest American victory ever, like even New Orleans, except this was during the Mexican-American War. And then that just when he was becoming super popular, President Polk deliberately takes troops away from Taylor and gives them to General Winfield Scott to capture Veracruz because he's trying to check Taylor's growing popularity, right? The idea is that like if Taylor has a weakened army, then he will start losing because he kept on winning every battle he could in the Mexican-American War. And Polk did not want him to become president. But it doesn't matter because by then he was so famous that
You
he
couldn't
was
stop it. Yeah.
yeah, he was elected as the Whig Party candidate, despite the fact that the Democrat Polk tried his best to suppress him. All right, Franklin Pierce. All right, I got to do this one. This one really got me.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, I'll go. Right? He's 14th president. He served in the Mexican-American War. He entered actually as a private. He was and then started actually. He also recruited people for the New Hampshire militia. Became a brigadier general, leading victories in Mexico City. But the big thing with him was he actually suffered an injury after being thrown from his horse.
Okay,
He
yeah,
missed
Franklin Pierce. I'm telling you, man, this is
He
funny.
missed some
Did
of
you
the
look-
battles. Yeah, I saw
Yeah,
some of the stuff. Go ahead.
yeah. So they said he like was really into. He like really wanted to fight, and
They couldn't wait.
he was
Often they couldn't get to prove himself in the battlefield.
exactly. And President Polk actually gave Franklin Pierce the nomination as an attorney general, and Pierce winds up turning it down because he just wants to fight. He's like, oh, I don't want to sit behind a desk. Basically, that granted him a lot of respect, but the first part of his military career was not really similar to his counterpart, Zachary Taylor. So he volunteers to join the army as soon as the war with Mexico breaks out. It's 1846. So once the regiments are authorized by Congress, he's appointed colonel and is sent to Veracruz. When he arrives in Mexico City, he's promoted to brigadier general and is linked up with General Winfield Scott at the Battle of Contreras. So things are going really well, except as the battle starts, his horse gets spooked and it causes saddle to jam right into Pierce's groin. Pierce winds up like screaming. The horse then fell into a crevice, pinned Pierce under it. And then there are like battles happening. They need someone to command, but because Pierce is hurting from his private parts and is pinned by a horse, someone else takes command and gets the glory for that battle because Pierce is laying in a ditch. The next day, he's back on the battlefield, but he winds up injuring his knee so bad that he can't really gallop so quickly and catch up with everybody else. So he falls behind his men, and the battle was actually over by the time he catches up to them. So at this point, Pierce it's just not working out for him. So General Scott is actually like, I'm not going to give this guy command of this brigade. Like, it's not going to work.
Just bad luck.
Yeah, so he's like, fine, you know what? Let's try this out. So he's like, all right, I'm giving you command again. This is the next battle. Churubusco, I think. Churubusco is the name of the battle.
Yes.
And, Pierce is like, all right, I'm doing this. And literally within the first few minutes, his leg starts hurting him so much, his wounded leg, that as he's trying to charge into battle, he actually passes out on his horse in the middle of the battle and falls off of it and never really fights. And that is President Franklin Pierce.
Yeah, but he did become president. Like, it didn't hurt him politically, obviously.
No.
That stuff comes out or whatever, but it just didn't,
Crazy though.
It didn't affect. Yeah, it's one of those stories that like it just wasn't meant to be. Like sometimes it's just not meant to be. And Franklin Pierce, his war hero-ness, I guess you want to call it, was not meant to be.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of these are like just little ones, but I mean, President Abe Lincoln did fight, right? I mean, briefly.
Same thing with Buchanan, like right before him. There was a little bit. Lincoln, he served in the militia during the 1832 during the Black Hawk War.
Yep, Native American uprisings.
Andrew Johnson was the military governor for Tennessee.
Yep.
And served as the brigadier general until 1865. But I guess the next big one, obviously,
that actually
Grant.
served. Yeah.
That served, fought, did everything was Grant. So I guess we've done podcasts on Grant in the past. I thought one interesting thing about Grant, he didn't plan to make a career of military service, right? He fought in the Mexican-American War, which is what you see with a lot of like the generals in the Civil War. They all fought in the Mexican-American War. In 1864, Lincoln appoints him as the general-in-chief, a little bit different. And he comes up with the strategy really to direct Sherman's army across the South, while he worked to defeat Lee's army in the North, and eventually led over to beat the Confederacy. He gets the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, where he really like stipulated the terms and avoided the treason trials and stuff, things of that nature. But I thought one interesting thing about Grant that I found, and I don't think we talked about that much in the podcast, was that he really hated military tradition, particularly uniforms. And how he always used to get like demerits for at West Point for his uniform being unkempt. And then like later on when he was the general of the Union Army, he refused to wear a general's uniform. He just wore a private's uniform. He just had like a single star stitched on each shoulder that indicated his rank. He had like no interest in that sort of stuff
You know, next time I get in trouble for dress code
whatsoever.
or wearing a sweatshirt in school, I'm
Yeah,
going to say, you know, Ulysses S. Grant.
just yeah, try that.
Yeah, see how far I got. Hey, you're the administrator. You know, you'll probably get me in trouble if I wore a sweatshirt.
We don't really, people wear what they want. That's, I think
But,
the
you know, that's the
least of our
thing.
concern.
That's the thing, though, right? Like when we started teaching, it was always tie, shirt, tie, shirt, tie, shirt, tie for guys. You know, women were always like dresses, and
Well, that was
they,
part of the observation.
yeah, like that no longer is part of the observation, right? Like
No,
grooming.
no. Yeah.
So things
I
have
guess if you're wearing,
definitely.
like a Rip Metallica shirt, maybe you'll get in trouble.
Well, yeah, I'm not gonna teach with a Rip Metallic. I mean, maybe I'll wear like a Star Wars T-shirt. We try our best, but I could always bring it up and be like, "Ulysses S. Grant, you know, he was against this stuff."
There you go. Why not?
Why not? All right, another guy that kind of became famous because of his Civil War record was Rutherford B. Hayes. I did not know until I started really doing this research. Like he was like pretty legit when it came
Yeah,
to
he
fighting.
was a major general. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was a major general. He was elected to Congress first, and then obviously became president after that. But yeah, he was a war hero. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Active war record. Basically, before he became president, he was a Union officer during the Civil War. When in September of 1862, Robert E. Lee's army of Northern Virginia was advancing toward northward into Maryland, the Union Army under General McClellan met Robert E. Lee's divided Confederates in a series of 3 major battles. At the head of each of these battles, and the lead regiment, was Lieutenant Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes of the 23rd Ohio. He wound up charging an entrenched Confederate position. A bullet tore through his arm, shattering his bone. They said that he basically tied a handkerchief around his wound,
Yeah.
and then rubbed a lot of dirt into it and just
Just to
continued
stop it
fighting.
completely. Well, that's what he did during that. Like
Yeah.
it was just let's just go. Like, what are you gonna do? If you wait around, you're probably gonna bleed out. So you have to do something. And
But
also,
even like when I was looking into it, they're like that normally Civil War, you would lose an arm to such an injury, but for some reason he did not get infected. Like he just kept on fighting and just disregarded it.
I think a lot of these presidents too, especially when we get to some of the ones later on, they just survived. A lot of it was like luck.
Yeah.
Like, you just think how different, like it was, and I guess that's part of the battlefield too. Like, you know where to go and everything, I'm sure, and you have the fighting, you have the experience, but a lot of it is just right place, right time, or wrong
No.
place, wrong time, and then that's it.
Or
you know?
just, or just like an inch this way versus an inch that way. I mean, he had a horse shot down
Shot
from under him.
Yeah,
Yep.
that happens all the time.
Battle of Kernstown. Then that same battle, he got shot in the other shoulder, right? He still survived that. Then at a battle, Cedar Creek in 1864, he was actually struck in the head by a round, like literally grazed his head and cut his head open. And after that, he was promoted to Brigadier General. So this guy was pretty legit. He was elected to the presidency in 1876, and he never actually really won any major electoral popular vote. This is known as oftentimes as the 1877 Compromise of 1877 that ended Reconstruction. And he's kind of vilified for that. Like, he was pushed into office. But at the same time, I mean, this guy was...
He was a war hero. Like, you got to say,
Yeah,
he
pretty
as
badass.
far as like he saw combat, he was injured in combat. So
And again, a
Sure.
bunch of other guys here that we could talk about. James Garfield was a lieutenant colonel in the Union.
yeah, he was actually the youngest one ever to make major general. So
Yeah,
that's kind of like a little foot in
that's
history.
fun fact.
Yeah, Chester A. Arthur also served as a brigadier general during served in
Civil War.
the New York militia during the Civil War. Never actually saw combat because, interesting, his family actually had ties with the Confederacy.
Interesting.
He had some members in his extended family were members of the Confederacy, so he never actually saw active combat really because of that reason. Benjamin Harrison also served. He followed in his grandfather's footsteps, served in the American Army during the Civil War. He was brigadier general of the Volunteers. McKinley also served. He was a major in 1865. He only resigned. He resigned from the army as soon as the war ended. So you have these people who were there, but I guess the next big one, obviously,
Oh, yeah.
that we'll kind of fast forward to, and it's obviously the big one, That would be probably what you say. Your hero. I feel like if
I mean, this guy, he got
this is,
awarded the
this
Congressional
is,
Medal of Honor for his actions in the Spanish-American War. This
yeah,
guy.
but he also got that given to him in what 2001
Yeah,
or
like
something.
3 years ago or something. Yeah.
It was a while. It was a little
Took
bit.
100 years.
I mean, we're
Hey,
talking about Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore
yes,
Roosevelt. So
yes,
he
yes,
was a
yes.
political person, but he did actually leave politics in 1898 to organize the Rough Riders, and he did that for political reasons. One, he wanted to fight, I think, also, but he did it for political reasons, and was a volunteer cavalry fighting force in the Spanish-American War.
Yeah.
He fought Cuba. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, like Pete talked about, but after his death, way after his death.
Well, yeah, he distinguished himself at the Battle of San Juan Hill.
Yeah, people know that story, obviously.
Yeah. He basically leads a charge as the only man on horseback, because everyone else, the horses never made it there, even though they're a cavalry unit, the horses were not delivered in time. Makes a charge up the hill, moves from position to position as his men advance up this hill behind him in open ground against an entrenched enemy. When his horse is stopped by barbed wire, he winds up saying, forget the horse, and just goes on foot the rest of the way. They reach the hill, hand-to-hand combat, take over a gun, shoot into a nearby hill, and he is eventually awarded the Medal of Honor for his action. Still the only president with a Medal of Honor.
Only president received that award, yes.
Kind of cool. All right, what's
Well, Truman served
I
in
love
World
Truman.
War I.
This was a cool story.
I mean, Truman served in World War I. He was a colonel in the Army Reserve, so that's something that people I don't probably forget about Truman. I would say,
I like
right?
Truman. Truman's
that
my man.
Is that he? Yeah, I thought Roosevelt was your guy.
Yeah, but so is Truman. I like a lot of these guys. Like I like Roosevelt for like the conservationist stuff and like national parks and the wilderness kind of thing. But Harry S. Truman, I feel like is a guy that just no one gave him a chance his whole
I think
life.
history looking back is much more favorable on him than at the time. I think a lot of stuff with Truman. So he was denied entry to West Point because he had bad eyesight.
Mm-hmm.
And then he actually enlisted in the Missouri National Guard because he memorized the eyesight test.
Yep.
Now, it's just what I heard is actually something a lot of people did back then.
I mean, he was way past the standard for legal blindness. That's how bad his eyesight was.
But then he remembers it, and then you give him a gun and go fight. Like,
that's crazy.
Like that's just kind of like, why would you? He says anyway.
Hey.
But that's what he did. He actually recruited soldiers for his unit. He was promoted to captain, all right, of Battery D in France. And he later achieved the rank of colonel in the Army Officer Reserve Corps. So he had a pretty successful military career, like one that you could definitely put on the resume. Definitely, had its merits.
Yeah,
he saw combat. Like he was in combat. The battle.
Yeah, and World War I vet.
In World War I, yeah.
And that's so crazy because he becomes president in World War II in like weaning, months of the war, and everyone's always like, "Well, he's not going to be as good as FDR." But FDR, he was obviously.
FDR did not see combat. Yes,
he did not see combat.
But his dog was promoted to private.
Yeah, but Truman he knew his stuff, when it comes to war. And they say that he was initially unpopular. He was a captain of the artillery company in World War I, and then at one point they were overrun by the Germans, and his men started to break and run in every direction, and Truman just lost it. They said it was like string of profanity, screaming at his men like in their face, and they became so afraid of him that they actually stopped retreating, and just faced the Germans and started to fight, which is kind of cool. In the start of Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918, so Truman observed German artillery setting up an attack unit in one of his areas of responsibility, but he noticed they had a lot of dogs and horses with them. So he actually waited for the Germans to move the horses and dogs out of the way before he dropped artillery on it, because he was like a huge animal lover.
Yes, yeah.
So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, all these so many of these little stories out there that I guess just kind of are footnotes or like forgotten by history, but they're kind of interesting to bring up and just talk about. Just try to make people aware of them. That's all. Keep the one going. I guess move on to the next one. 34th President of the United States.
Go.
Is Eisenhower. Obviously, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant after graduating from West Point. He served in World War I and World War II. Obviously, World War II, he was the Supreme Allied Commander,
five-star rank general,
5-star rank Army. Right, in 1944, he was so also the first Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, which is something we've been talking about trying to do a podcast on a while, just like the history of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We'll get to at some point. And in 52, he retires from active duty. He runs for president. We know he wins the presidency, military industrial complex, all that information. But yeah, I mean, I think his military resume people just know about. Like, so obviously I don't
Yeah, yeah. But
spend too
again,
much time.
nothing like no, like not like Truman fighting in the trenches as much. Dwight D. He
Well,
kind of
he was
passed.
he was a commander. He was
Yeah,
one
yeah,
like leading the troops and stuff like that. But one that I guess people do know that he served, but I guess some of the story is not always known. Is on the next one is Kennedy.
yeah. That's a cool story. Go ahead.
So with Kennedy, he has this interesting story that I remember always bringing up to my students when we talked about him and stuff like that. Basically, he was a lieutenant in the Navy, and he was awarded the Purple Heart and the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, which was the highest non-combat decorated awarded for heroism for his acts during World War II. So basically, he was commander of a torpedo boat, and it was ran by a Japanese destroyer and cut in half. And as it sank, Kennedy injured his back. He basically broke his back in several places. And with his injured back, he rescued several of the men and then led these survivors to a nearby island. He actually also saved a badly burned crew member. He placed him in a life jacket and then grabbed the life jacket in his teeth, and then basically dragged this crew member to shore for 3 miles.
Yep.
And then Kennedy always had this injury for this, and we've talked about in our Kennedy's podcast that caused him a lot of pain. But that was really his main story, and that was also why we know his brother was killed in combat. His father wanted his sons to serve in the military. He's like, oh no, they have to serve in the military because that's going to help their political careers later on if they need to serve in this war. But Kennedy was a war hero by all accounts. Like that right there, I'm surprised they never made a movie about that. Like just that.
I think they did. PT 109. There's a movie. It's an old movie. It's like a TV movie.
I'm saying but not like a modern day intense movie because because I mean he's one of those figures and stuff like that, and just showing that times. But again, it just shows like if that boat hit them a few feet one way or the other, he could have been killed. He could have drowned trying to save this guy. He broke his back. Like
nuts.
Some people stub their toe, they take off from work. This guy, he breaks his back and he's dragging burned people. It's just that's what happens in combat. I'm sure, but it's just an interesting story. Interesting story.
Definitely pretty cool. After him, when you start looking at some of the other ones, it almost like their heroic deeds kind of lessen a little bit, right? I mean, Johnson was he was in the Navy, active duty as a lieutenant commander, right? 3 days after Pearl Harbor. Then he went into Naval Reserves from Texas and served in the Navy Reserves until 1964. Richard Nixon, this is interesting because he was a Quaker, so he would have been exempt from any service, but he still applied to the Naval Reserve and was an active duty in the South Pacific, and the commander also of Naval Reserves until 1966. That's only 3 years before he became president.
Before he became president, he was there for a while. Yeah, he was there for a while.
And another guy, I mean, it seems like the next 3, right? Because then you have Ford.
Well, they're all that age, so obviously they're all served in World War II.
But they all joined the Navy. So Ford joined the Navy
right after Pearl Harbor attack. Yeah.
Yeah, same premise as the other two. Then stayed in the Navy Reserves, and he was a lieutenant commander. Jimmy Carter. We got a Jimmy Carter, man. Have we ever done a podcast on Jimmy Carter?
No, but we've talked about him with different things. Remember, Carter was a smart guy.
He's a smart guy. He is a smart guy.
I forgot he's still alive. Yes. Right, he's the oldest living president, obviously. But he was actually served as a nuclear-powered submarine until 1953. Like that's what this guy did. So he was a lieutenant in the Navy. Obviously, served in World War II. But he was a nuclear engineer basically on these submarines.
Nuclear submarines.
Yeah. That's one reason when he was president, when he visited 3 Mile Island, they were saying he was talking to the engineers at 3 Mile Island, like that nuclear issue that happened. He was knew what he was talking about. And they're like, how do you know? They must have debriefed. He's like, no, I worked on these. And, it's very
back
similar
in 53.
What I saw on the subs in 53. They're like, what? So he was he knows his stuff with that thing. Yeah, but he was, like I said, I mean, submarines too, is a totally different class if you're on a submarine. You ever been inside an actual submarine?
Me? As a tour thing once next to, what do you call it? The Intrepid.
Yeah, there's that one. There was one in New Jersey, USS Ling. It's still there. It got destroyed. I got really destroyed when Hurricane Sandy, but it's still there. I remember my grandfather taking it to a diesel powered sub. Obviously, the ones next to the Intrepid, and then on Hawaii we went on a little submarine too. Not like a military submarine, but they're tiny. I couldn't imagine being there for months.
Yeah, dude. I'm claustrophobic, so put me in a car for too long and I start freaking out.
Yeah, it's just you can't even stand. It's just
No. Although one of the greatest World War II movies is Das Boot. I don't know if you ever saw it, but that was intense German movie about World War II. If anyone hasn't seen it, that's boot watch it. President Ronald Reagan. He was an actor, right? So he was in the army from
Well, he
42
did.
to 45 during World
He
War
was
II,
there.
but he never left the United States.
Well, he did training videos, right,
Yeah, he
and
did training
patriotic
videos. He
films. Yeah.
basically started in patriotic films and filmed training videos for soldiers overseas. And he served in the Army and Air Corps, First Motion Picture Unit. He was an actor through World War II.
Well, he's doing his duty, right? He's doing what he needs to do to help.
And yet, his vice president, this is like probably the last
But he,
legit military guy.
yeah, I would say so. Is President George H.W. Bush, right? He enlisted as an aviator on his 18th birthday. He actually became one of the youngest aviators in naval history because he was sent to the front lines like shortly after that, and on a bombing run on the Japanese island of Chichijima. His plane was they successfully bombed their target. Right, he was a torpedo plane, I believe, but the plane was badly damaged and it plummeted into the ocean. And he's the only one that survived. Both of his crew members died. He actually parachuted out of the plane. He survived. He landed in the water, injured but alive, and he floated there for I think like 7 or 8 hours. And the whole time, like the Japanese were like trying to find him and shoot at him. So he's trying to hide from the Japanese, like floating in the water.
He's like a
He was
teenager. This is the
yeah,
crazy part.
18 years old. He was swallowing way too much salt water. He was getting constantly stung by jellyfish this entire time. And he winds up, eventually he was rescued by an American submarine and he was awarded the Distinguished Flyers Cross citation for his efforts. His son does go on to serve in the Texas Air National Guard and later becomes president also. But like, this is like a legit, like, yeah, he was in a fighter pilot, like fought in the war, shot down in combat, survived. Like this is legit, like war service. Absolutely.
Yeah. And after
Which,
that, he enrolls
which I don't,
in Yale.
yeah. But I don't remember hearing that much. I mean, I was just younger, I guess, but I don't remember hearing much about his World War II contributions when
Record.
he was running for president as
You would
much. Like
think they would have played that up, right?
I know, like you got, you were you bombed a Japanese, island, survived being attacked by the Japanese, you earned this flying cross, but a lot of them just didn't want to, I guess, bring it up as much too.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that because he's the last one that actually they say saw like real combat. He's the last of these World War II era veterans also.
Yep. And like I said, his son is actually, I think, the last one that really was involved in the military. So Bush, George
Air
W.
National
Bush,
Guard, yeah.
it was Texas Air National Guard, but during the Vietnam War years, so between 68 and 73. So he wasn't in Vietnam, but during the Vietnam War, he served in the military.
He was active duty.
Active duty,
he was
stateside.
active duty, yeah.
So,
But
and
I
he's the
think,
last one. After that, none of the presidents that
and
followed.
I wanted to see like why that was, and I was saying that was really because of that Vietnam War, and you had a lot of the presidents there, and it just wasn't. They call it the bamboo ceiling. Like there has been people who have run for president who served in Vietnam. Right?
Well, yeah, John McCain.
John McCain, right? Al Gore, John Kerry. Okay, so there's plenty of ones that did, but they all they're saying their service is not seen as like what it was early on. Like it's that these war heroes, it's not as big of a thing, and they're saying the future. When I say that, I'm talking about a lot of these political punches and stuff like that. That like they think that if someone who becomes president in the future, if they're like a global war on terror veteran, right, that it's kind of in spite of their time in uniform, and they're not going to be insisted by it. It doesn't assist people quite as much. And you talk about like, I remember it was kind of a big thing during Bill Clinton's presidential campaign because there's these letters that came out in the 60s that he was opposed to the Vietnam War. So that's one reason.
Yeah, draft dodgers and all that stuff. I remember that was used against him.
He said he took his chances with the draft. All right. So whatever you want to take of that, whether he was a draft dodger or not, who knows? But you have, I'm not getting political here, but like Trump, when he was running, he just was like, yeah, listen, I found ways to get out of the draft.
Yeah.
And he was like, proud of it. So you had that. Obama outright said, he was against the Vietnam War during that time. So a lot of these they just said, they were against it and it was against their beliefs. And
yeah, but Vietnam, he wasn't old enough to.
No, but he was like, no, he wasn't old enough to partake. Well, no, he wasn't old enough to partake, but he was against it. Obviously, he was alive. And and just talks about that. Same with Joe Biden got student determinants for the war. So but the last couple have not been.
Biden's up there, so he could have been around in a couple of wars.
Well, he was born in 42, but he had he got a student determinant, draft determinant
during the Vietnam,
during Vietnam. And same thing with Trump, they were able to get find ways to circumvent it. I guess would be the best way to say.
Interesting.
But like they're saying, you just have, and you had war heroes that did, like we talked about, Kerry, McCain, who was actually criticized, right? If you
Yeah.
remember that when he was
Yeah.
running and stuff like that.
That's a cool story. McCain's story, again, not to get political, I think we should probably do like a podcast or something about just
his legacy,
known Vietnam War veterans. You know what I mean? Anyway, I think this pretty much covers it. These are your presidents, guys.
Yeah,
that,
and the ones who didn't serve, in case you're wondering, was John Adams, right? John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, Millard Fillmore, Grover Cleveland, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, obviously, Clinton, Obama, Trump, and Biden. So again, it's the modern ones that you really see. It wasn't a prerequisite to be military service early on, but it was kind of like
it was nice
kind of required.
It was like a nice thing on your resume.
Wasn't going to hurt.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So that pretty much concludes our podcast on your fighting presidents. If you guys ever want to contact us, you could find us at www.historyteacherstalkingpodcast.com. We're always here to answer any of your questions. Make sure you click that subscribe button and don't be afraid to leave us a review. We do appreciate those. So thank you so much, guys, and we'll see you next week.
Stay safe, everybody.
I hope everyone enjoyed our podcast, and if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.